I have to admit, I used to be a little bit of a book snob. I wouldn't even consider a Kindle, let alone an audiobook. It just felt like cheating. But that is until I tried Audible and Open Audible. Ever wonder where I find the time to read all the books that my guests have written on this show? Well, this is the answer. When I'm behind in my reading, I just jump to audiobook. Open Audible is a cross-platform audiobook manager designed for Audible users that can allow you to download, view, manage, and connect your favorite audiobooks on MP3 so that you can enjoy them across all your devices. Best of all, you can control it all from a desktop application. I'm giving away a copy of Open Audible for the entire month of November. All you have to do is sign up to my mailing list. You'll find the link in the description below, or go to openaudible.org for more information. Today's podcast is sponsored by the guys in the flag jackets. Gary and Jim are the guys in the flag jackets. Every week, these two sit down and discuss a wide variety of political issues, all the way from the weird and wonderful world of local politics to more obscure political ideas and concepts. Ever wondered about the 1979 Chicago mayoral election? Well, I hadn't either until these guys came along and blew my mind. Or did you know that the layout of the ballot can have a crazy influence upon the way you vote? Neither did I, but thankfully Gary and Jim were there to tell me all about it. So if you want a fun and intriguing look into US politics from a unique perspective, check out the Guys in the Flag Jackets podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find the link in the description below. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am here with Andrew Small, a fellow at the German Marshall Fund and author of the new book, The Rupture, China and the Race for the Global Future. You can see that, there we go. The Global Race for the Future. Not the race for the global future. Same thing, really.
Much the same thing. It is basically the same thing.
So thanks for sending me the book. You may be surprised to know that it actually gave me quite a lot of hope, strangely, because I had long been under the impression that a lot of the people working in the sort of upper echelons of government and diplomacy were sort of, it was at least my view that they had like fallen asleep at the wheel in regards to China and sort of not recognized the threat that they are in like many different spheres, whether that's actually like a military threat or whether that's, you know, sort of just to the hegemony of like Western corporations or like, you know, within the diplomatic sphere around the world. And I felt like they were becoming a lot more powerful than we were willing to admit. And it seemed from reading your book, actually, it seems like there's a lot more people within the governments who are very aware of this and are sort of making moves to counter that, which was quite hopeful, which is great. So where did you first start sort of thinking about this idea of China sort of like potentially challenging like the quote unquote West for like to be the global power, essentially?
I mean, when I first started working really fully on China, and I mean, I lived in China before China was a global power, right? When I was teaching English there in the late 90s, I don't think anyone at this juncture was talking about China as a peer competitor of the United States. It was so far off. The power differentials were so vast. And it was only in the kind of early to mid 2000s when I was going back to work in Beijing that you started to get this real takeoff phase that China, which again, I mean, as a point of comparison, was probably on the same economic scale as the UK, France, something like that at that juncture. But it was becoming a power that had global weight and mattered in a whole series of spheres that it hadn't before. And I mean, actually, the first sort of pamphlet that I wrote was called Preventing the Next Cold War, because you could see even then a lot of the long-term trends unfolding in a particular direction. And if they broke in a particular way, if economic growth continued as it did, if all of the trends headed in a certain direction, which in many ways they did end up heading in that direction, there was always the prospect that you were going to head into a very different kind of phase of relations. And I kind of followed the dynamics on all the different sides. And for me, I was always following it from China's relations with, as it were, the West as a whole. It was never just about the US and China. It was never just about Europe and China or the UK and China. The thing that was always interesting to me looking out as I used to as well from the Beijing end, was this was how it was understood from there. This was a kind of systemic way of thinking about things that said that you're dealing in some sense or other with the US alliance network, the free market democracies, and the kind of the ideology, liberal democracy, and things like that. It was although you had, of course, this particular fixation on the United States, it was always viewed, I think, through that prism. Is this a system that's generating growth, technology, success, rather than it just being the purview of a single state? So it's something that then at different cuts after this point, the question was, what form of China are we dealing with? What form of relationship is possible? And in a sense, where are some of these trends headed? Where are the internal trends in China headed? Do we still have grounds for expecting that there may still be economic reform, that some of the potential political changes could come further down the line? Is freedom advancing for the Chinese people in different ways, even if it's not advancing in kind of classic political ways? Are you still seeing the well-being of the Chinese people, the capacity to travel more freely, express themselves more freely? How is that moving? And just what is going on in the system on the Chinese side as well? And how is China thinking about how it handles the fundamentals of its relations with the West, and what the trade-offs are? And you've had all of these different cuts in which that's then tilted in different directions, either internally, as we're now dealing with Xi Jinping, or in its posture towards the rest of the world. And I think particularly after the financial crisis, I think that's still the marker point for a lot of people of saying that the calculations on the Chinese side started to shift. There was an attitude that was both that China's power position in relative terms had shifted markedly in its favor, and also that the questions of whether in the end the Western system produced the best kind of model, whether they were the teacher, as it were, on the economic side in particular, but in a certain sense that you saw this deference to the idea that China would be defensive of its own system, but didn't think its system was superior, really, other than a small number of cadres at the top of the party, and I'm not sure how convinced even they were. Yeah. But that started to move at that point. I mean, the book really does go back a little bit to some of those earlier points, and we've seen all of these things accelerate in the last few years, but it's been something I've certainly been thinking about the whole time that I've been dealing with China, at least since the early 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had I'm not old enough to have been watching it as long as maybe yourself or some of the other commentators in the space. So sometimes it's hard to get a grasp on how much things have actually changed. It's like I don't get the sense of perspective of looking back, because as long as I can remember, it had China has been like a growing threat, but in a real sense, because I was 14 in the 2008 crash, so that's the age at which I sort of started to pay any kind of attention to news or politics or any of these things. So it really has been my adult life has been it's been a threat that for me it was okay, well then, why are we not concerned about it? It was always my question. And so why do you think they were able to fly under the radar as a challenger in so many spheres for so long?
So I think there's a whole series of different reasons for this, and it's still something that people are, I think, wrestling with in retrospect, because I think there is still an unresolved debate, even among the people who do think now that there needs to be a very different set of China policies, as to whether what the West was doing through this whole period was ever the right course of action, and whether we're just adjusting to behavioral shifts and political shifts on the Chinese side.
Should we define what that course of action or what that sort of attitude previously was, just for people?
Yeah, I mean, so I think you've had two phases of this. I mean, you just had the phase of sort of unbridled optimism after the end of the Cold War that said, okay, it's only a matter of time here. China's a holdout. It's one of the few remaining communist systems. In the end, we've seen all sorts of other authoritarian states, non-communist authoritarian states, shift towards democracy at a certain level of per capita GDP, and you had all of these kind of predictive power that this would give. But you'd also seen the collapse of communism, and the idea that there was kind of total supremacy on all counts. There was only one success model, and that success model was how the West did things. And China was a fraction of Western GDP. We're not even talking about UK levels. We're talking about a developing country where there was considerable doubt still about whether it would really break through economically. And so I think the first phase was a generalized sense of optimism that you wouldn't have to worry about China. There was a timing question of when things would change, but it changed for everyone, and everyone had to understand that this was the superior system. And that wasn't a policy; that was just a sweeping judgment on how the world was moving, because that was the way it seemed to be moving. The end of history version of things. I think you then had a different attitude at a certain point, which was to say, which was a bit kind of tighter, which was to say. We can see that China is pushing through a whole series of reforms. It's becoming more marketized. In the end, how will the system hold up? We're seeing the economic transformation. We're seeing the rise of the internet. We're seeing all of these kind of shifts. Can authoritarian systems really hold up with all of these transformative changes that are underway? And in the meantime, the economy is thriving. Our firms are able to benefit from this. We want to push further opening, and we're under no illusions that it's going to be quick change. But we do suspect that this is not a system that's going to hold up as it was. And I think that was where you were getting in the early 2000s, and China's WTO accession and things like that. And at each point, it's been slightly redefined. I think what the kind of more complacent view of this has amounted to, because I think it started to shift towards something that was complacency at a certain point. It started to be, China's actually not going to change. We're seeing a more resilient system on the Chinese side. We're increasingly doubting that there's any projection that the Chinese Communist Party is going to fall in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15, however far out one looked. And actually, we're just going to have to deal with this system. But it's a system we can live with. It's a sort of soft authoritarianism. This is not North Korea. It's not totalitarian. And we're seeing we're seeing the development of Chinese society, the Chinese economy. There's an unleashing of entrepreneurship. We're seeing positive changes here. And actually, I mean, this was still the critical thing. It was a strategy on China's part that they would not act as a challenger. They would deliberately fly under the radar. They would not antagonize the partners that they depended on to not contain them, form a counterbalancing coalition. And it wasn't even a counterbalancing coalition that you needed. You only needed the United States at certain points to take the sort of moves that you saw in the mid-90s with Taiwan. It was complete military dominance on the US part. They still needed access to technology. They needed access to finance. And so the approach was very much the old Deng Xiaoping kind of language around it, which was hide your brightness, bide your time, don't stick your neck out. And so when you had these kind of crises that came up through this period as well, whether it was 9/11 or the global financial crisis or any of these things, China acted in a constructive, system stabilizing kind of way. It did not look like a disruptive power. It looked like a power that cared about, in some sense or other, particularly in these sorts of situations, the system kind of holding together. And I would say the financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis and things were really the exemplification of that. This was a point where you have this anecdote from Hank Paulson where he's in Beijing, and I think it's for the Olympics, and he gets this news that the Russians have been telling the Chinese that they should dump their holdings in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And the Chinese saying, we're not going to do this. We do not want the system to collapse. This is going to be bad for us, but it's going to be bad for the system as a whole.
Well, they would
And
have
so you had
started
this,
pulling their money, like the US, if the entire US financial system had started to collapse, like they would have immediately started pulling all of their money from all their Chinese like investments, well, presumably.
well, I mean, yes. I mean, I think the sense was though that, I mean, because of the way China was approaching its currency, it is absolutely astronomical dollar holdings. And if China had decided that it wanted to take the US down at this juncture, it would have been very damaging to China too. But the sense was the interests were intertwined. There was some genuine form of interdependence that you had with China that it recognized as such. And so I think all of these were factors that kind of that played. I mean, it meant as well that there were always these more urgent crises. I think this was the other thing that happened through this whole period. So any time there was a mindedness, as you had at some different junctures, even when George W. Bush was first elected, at certain other moments, you had even the first efforts at pivot to Asia under Obama. You had people identifying the problem and then always there was something more pressing, and it always seemed, given China's power position, you could kind of put it off for another few years. So the Eurozone crisis, well, at least China's being helpful when it comes to the statements it makes on bond purchases and things, and if it's buying some infrastructure at fire sale prices, we'll worry about the security implications of that later. We've got a really urgent crisis to deal with now. Or it's the Arab Spring, or it's Crimea, or it's and at each point, when China was acting relatively unproblematically during these crises, in some cases relatively helpfully, the view was always, okay, we have this growing list of issues, growing list of problems, growing concerns. We see that China is now kind of catching up, but also still not far enough yet. I think there was still this attitude as well that was, well, can China innovate was a debate for a period of time. Will China outpace us in AI and quantum and these things? It was, can China innovate at all? And I think from industry side, the view was always, and to some extent on the US military side as well, it was always China's several generations behind. It's not up here. It's not, we're always, and we're moving to, and we're staying ahead, and we're far enough ahead in economic terms, in technological terms, in military terms, that we can afford to see how this plays out. We can see maybe there's something that will come along and change everything. We don't have to upend everything yet. We're still making a certain amount of money in China, even if they're ripping off technology, even if even if we're having to do all of these problematic deals, joint venture deals that mean that they then take over some kind of previous generation of technology, that's like, we can still live with it. We're still making money and we can continue to kind of outpace them. And I think that just went on for a very, very sustained period of time. And even when you'd have kind of red flags waved, I mean, in the book, I talk about, the Italians and the Spanish complaining about, we were system rivals since forever. You have all of the data on what happened after China joined the WTO, the China shock analysis, about the political impact of what this was, and they were saying, well, yes, this is globalization, but there's a hell of a lot of subsidies being put into this on the Chinese side as well. This is still not fair competition.
Do you know, actually, that you are literally the perfect person to ask this. I have been wondering this, and it's just popped into my head for literally since I discovered the fact that it's my understanding that under World Trade Organization rules that state aid is basically like not allowed in industry, that there's like a lot of rules against state aid within the World Trade Organization. Isn't China's entire economy state aid?
Yeah. I mean, this is actually the slightly amazing thing that also went on. Like, China joins the WTO, and then you have, for the first decade, which is where some of the biggest impact actually was, when you're looking at, because the China shock theory is this thing that was, there was this highly concentrated impact in certain industries with real political effects, given where this played out in the UK, played out in the US, particularly notably. And this was the period in which there was the kind of most profound impact of what the trade interactions with China looked like. And it was clear in a number of industries that there were unfair subsidies. But through this whole stretch, the 2000s, WTO cases were not being brought. The view was always this can be negotiated with China. WTO cases were seen as kind of bad form, that this was something that should be negotiated out. And a little bit later than that, you have this point where the European Commission decides that they're going to go after a couple of industries, solar and telecoms. And because they say, well, look, these are the industries of the future. These are the areas where surely, if we're looking at cases of unfair subsidies, we have to care about these, even if we're not caring as much as we should about steel or any of the other sectors that ultimately people moved on, but moved rather slowly on. And then they were kneecapped by, in this case, Germany, that said, again, it's unfriendly. We don't want to bring these cases. Some of the firms are often unhelpful as well, because the Chinese side is quite good at making sure that they have some equities there and will only come to the European Commission where their industry is virtually decimated, by which point some of these things are too late. So, these two big cases that they tried to bring, which would have been a pretty effective way at that time of going after Huawei, and may have been able to slow down the hit that you had on the European solar sector, were just wiped out. They were not able to use the means that had been put in place and should have been in place, because, again, the political attitude of how you conduct relations with China and economic relations with China was quite different. And now we're getting all of this creativity about, looking at it as being China Inc., looking at the kind of colossal cross-subsidization that's going on. We're in a phase now where even talking about the private sector in China has become, less meaningful than it used to be. But now it's almost impossible to get any of these things done through the channels that might once have actually made a difference and would have put China under pressure. And now instead, all of these are going to have to be approached in other ways, and the WTO won't be able to help.
Yeah, I guess it's also quite complex. Like another thing that really opened my eyes was the book The Shock Doctrine from Naomi Klein, which I think I've referenced like 60 times on this show. I think it's possibly one of the best books there's ever been written, or at least nonfiction. And she talks a lot about how, like, the idea that it was China Inc. was kind of hidden behind, like, it used to be like directly state-owned industries, and then what a lot of what basically happened through the 90s was they harnessed the idea of privatization and like companies going public and using the mechanisms of capitalism, but then the owners were not the state anymore, but it was just members of the CCP or their family who became the owners. So they have theoretically still got the same level of control, but it's hidden behind a whole bunch of layers of ownership that you can't trace.
Yeah. And I think it's been a very complex picture to try to determine, like, what is the entity that you're really dealing with on the Chinese side? What is a subsidy and what isn't? What is going into it that's electricity pricing? What is it that's the kind of support for infrastructure development? There's so many different component parts to it. And the ownership and structures of these things have moved so much on the Chinese side. And it's been, the interesting thing in the last few years is more of it has been made almost transparent. It's opaque in one sense, but what has transparently happened is the hand of the party has come in much more kind of comprehensively. You've had certain things more institutionalized and legalized that were maybe done more informally before, but it has been a real clawback of the independence of what bits of the private sector you had, because there were areas in which wealthy individuals in China were also dictating terms to bits of the party at certain points in certain areas. It was not. This is in a sense one of the things that Xi Jinping was also trying to clamp down on, to show very fully who was in charge. And you saw that particularly in one of the most independent previously areas of the Chinese economy, which was the consumer-facing tech sector, where they just absolutely went after all of these people, Jack Ma and all of these the people that had been the kind of, well, here's the benign face of what a rising tech savvy private sector China could look like. All of that's just been reined in, and so it's become much easier to point to certain things now that in the past, when one was running this analysis, were kind of hidden behind various layers of state-owned state asset entities and in kind of cross-cutting industrial subsidies and all of these sorts of things. Now it's just the party is in control. There are cells and specific individuals individuals who are kind of who've been put in these companies. There is a parallel structure now that means that the private sector has to answer to a different boss.
So it seems like to me that the point, like the real turning point in terms of like Western policy towards China was basically like the Huawei 5G debacle, whatever you want to describe it as. So like, what do you think it was about the 5G infrastructure and that technology that made it like that really brought this like full force into sort of the mainstream of discussion about international policy and whether we wanted to like cooperate with China and on what level?
So I think there were two really interesting things about 5G, because I mean you can look at all these other kind of developments and I mean what we've seen with the COVID pandemic, what we've seen with how China's handled the Ukraine crisis, and just the kind of the catch up that you'd seen from China in military and technological terms. I think all of these things are going on in the background. You have these kind of shifting assessments taking place in the US military among advanced industries in places like Germany that had previously been quite relaxed about the developments on the Chinese side. And did think they could stay a few steps ahead. But the interesting thing about what 5G does is, on the US side, what it does is, I think, lead to an understanding of the challenge that China poses in something that is more like systemic terms, because you can't think about all of the different dimensions of what 5G represents as a technology while thinking about it through a US-China prism alone. In the most kind of straightforward terms of this, the main competitors to Huawei and ZTE on the Chinese side, the only ones left standing in the telecom sector that could replicate what they could do were two European firms, Ericsson and Nokia. So when the US at this juncture started saying, well, we cannot afford to be as relaxed about 5G as we could about previous generations, about 4G. It's a more data-centric version of how the telecoms networks will evolve, that poses a whole different set of risks, and it's going to be far more central to really the enabling infrastructure of all of the other technologies that we care about in future as well. We're going to have to deal with this differently, but also the market basis for everything looked incredibly concerning. It was a version of kind of what the telecoms future for the world looked like that said, not only were we down to Nokia and Ericsson, one of them was almost certainly going to go, maybe both of them. You were basically having the squeezing out in a critical sector of potentially the entirety of the collective West's capacity to do this kind of basic but kind of critical task of developing the spine of how we communicated and for 5G a whole series of different things that we still haven't even dealt with yet in terms of kind of some of the new capabilities that will be possible in certain industries as a result of that. And so I think the understanding at that point on the US side was we can't act on this as this is not a US-China conversation. This is what does the global market in this entire field look like? What do we have to do in industrial terms to make sure that we're not outpaced? And it kind of fused the technology, security, industry, economic question that was this. I think the way that China policy started to be thought about differently, because it was all in its separate lanes before on the US side. It's only in the last few years that you started to get all of these questions seen in more integrated terms, to not have these sharp distinctions, which was always the way the Chinese side tended to think about these questions, but was also kind of waking up to that concept of systems. And Marxist thinking is much more amenable to that than the models that we'd had for thinking about this in the West. So I think on the US side, that was kind of what it represented, and the way that the US had to go about dealing with this was was just not a classic security problem. If you wanted to go around and persuade some pretty reluctant allies to upend the models that they had in place, spend money on this very differently, recast their relations with China as a result of it. And beyond this specific task of essentially shutting Chinese firms out from these decisions, which were very, very imminent decisions, you had this wider question of kind of what was this going to mean across a whole series of other sectors as well. And I mean, of course, if you're thinking about what we've just seen, the expansive export controls on semiconductors, for instance, it's the same issue with semiconductors. Semiconductors, yes, there's a critical part of it that's there on the US side, but it's the United States, it's Taiwan, it's the Netherlands, it's South Korea. There's a kind of a whole chain that you have to pull into effect and think about it across a system rather than just as a US-China problem. But I mean, more briefly, I mean, the Europe side was a different question. This was then this adjustment in thinking that said, because people still wanted to say, well, we want to be open to trade with China. We should not close our system down. But the difference between being open to normal trade, I mean, subsidized trade or otherwise, but certain forms of trade with China, and a version of things that said that China will build out your most critical networks, I think was something where when politicians who had not thought about this question started to look into it and what was at stake with it, it became harder and harder to make sense of why that was okay, why when if you put all the pieces together, you looked at what was going on in China under Xi Jinping, you saw the surveillance state in Xinjiang, you saw this kind of direction of flow that was heading in this much more rivalrous direction. Why on earth were you going to give China this access to the entirety of European telecom networks, and what on earth had gone on that meant that this was a difficult decision even? Why is it that Western telecoms firms had become so enmeshed with this that they were sitting around saying it will be impossible without China and it will cost so much money that it's absolutely impossible? I mean, that was a problem in its own right, that we'd already gone so far down the line on this that it was even in question. And so I think it did really help to wake people up across a number of European countries. People hadn't really thought about China in, again, systemic terms or some of these challenges before, to start to address a bit more seriously. Hang on, we need to revise the paradigm on this. We need to think about the openness of our systems differently. We need to define this differently. And we're dealing with something quite different when it comes to, selling socks or selling steel versus China's advanced capabilities in these sectors. It exports values with it in a different way, in a way that you don't have values embedded in socks. You do have values embedded in some of these advanced technologies, and so I think it led people to wrestle with this problem in a very different way. And certainly here in Germany, and of course we saw the debate in the UK, but I think across a number of countries in Europe, it forced quite a different reckoning with what the economic interactions with China really amounted to. And lastly, it was also a point in which China started, I mean, the use of economic coercion, the threats that you had. It's one thing threatening countries over how they handle Taiwan. People may not like it, but you can make a case for saying that this is China's core interest, and the same with the Dalai Lama and the Nobel Peace Prize for Liu Xiaobo and things like that. But threatening countries to say, unless you allow our firms into these sensitive sectors, you will be punished economically, which is what was essentially coming from. That also looked quite problematic in a very different way. The idea that you would use the economic coercion and the threats that China was able to bring to bear in quite a different way, that said, we have to be embedded in your systems in this way. You have to be open to us. You do not have a choice. If you make a different choice on this, you will be punished in other ways. And this was made openly and explicitly. And I think privately it was expressed in even sharper terms.
Yeah, I think your analogy there about the socks is fantastic. Is like it. Because I feel like that's how a lot of businesses would probably and continue to view China. Is just like, oh, it's a place to get cheap stuff, essentially, and they don't. So then for the like posterity, like why is it that we like aren't they just selling us bits of tech? Why is that a bad thing? They've just got some cheap, like, satellites or telecoms infrastructure they want to just sell us. Like, what's insidious about that?
Yeah, and I think this was the sort of. I mean, there was an interesting exercise that we also went through with this though, which was this was treated as a technical question. And if you talk to some of the people who work on this on the technical side, you talk to people uh, at NCSC, the GCHQ's kind of entity that handles these issues. The attitude is very much, look, there are all of these complex cyber threats. This is not the most important one. Why worried about this? In the hierarchy of concerns, we can kind of deal with the problems that are there with China. And this isn't something that everyone accepts. I mean, the US doesn't really accept this. The Australians didn't accept this. But there are plenty of people on the cyber side who say there are all of these vulnerabilities. Does it really matter who builds the system out? And I think you had this kind of technical discussion about this question that it was essentially about spying. It was about, can China siphon data? Will we notice if they do? Does 5G pose a different problem to the problems that we had in the networks before? What does it mean that you're having all of this extra volume of code, but you had these problems before? So, I mean, you could have a technical discussion about what this amounted to. The argument from some on this was this is why these kind of industrial questions and things came to the fore as well. This was not just a technical discussion. This was a question about it is a different problem to manage. Not on the technical side, there were questions about what does it mean if you have 5G outages. On the NATO side, there were literally questions about mobilization capacity, but I mean there were a whole series of different issues at stake again, which look different given the usages to which people were expecting 5G would be put. But it was also a wider economic industrial question that said, what does it mean if this entire sector is ceded to China, which is what it would have amounted to. You would basically have been creating a situation in which future generations, 6G, but already we were kind of getting close to this in 5G, would all be essentially controlled on the Chinese side. And it would be harder and harder to unwind this. I mean, this was already the problem that was 5G was building out from 4G, and I mean, you were already having a degree of embeddedness in the systems, even from where you started from. It was costly to kind of go through, even if over time, and make this adjustment when you became sufficiently enmeshed in it. But you were facing a situation in which this entire sector was going to be virtually lost. And yes, there were all sorts of other clever things that you could come up with that the people have been trying to in the advanced planning for 6G, and trying to provide kind of open systems that can be disaggregated. But we weren't there yet, and there was a real decision that basically said, and I mean, there were questions on the US side about whether you were going to have to subsidize one or other of these European companies to be able to, even if you were able to put political pressure on certain countries to change their decisions. And I think this became this question across the board. What are you willing to just cede as entire areas and fields when the consequences of this are in some respects unpredictable, but you can also see some predictable problematic consequences that could very well follow from it. So the technical question of whether they were able to get siphon data and what had gone on in the African Union, I mean, all the kind of Huawei stories and things that there had been before, for a lot of the people that were involved, that was not the crux of it. It was a whole series of other questions that mattered far more than some of the discussions that were being held between the NSA and GCHQ and some of the other agencies that were involved.
Sorry, I'm just looking up this African Union story. Wow, I didn't know about this. Wow. So yeah, so they hang on, pull this up for people to see. So they ran the tech in the African Union headquarters, and then they used it to spy on them, essentially, by the sounds of things.
there was certainly some unusual movements of data. Yes, I mean this has been when there's been this kind of question on these things that has been, well, really did what are our concerns about Huawei? What's their track record on this? And then when you dig into a number of the cases, the African Union one was a particularly prominent one. But you've had these cases of in other instances of Huawei technicians helping to pinpoint opponents of the government. I mean, there's the whole kind of array of different things that were really cause for concern. This was not just a speculative question, even without going into the specific cases, one of the things that was being lent on was that they had a legal obligation to spy for the Chinese government if they were instructed to. This was the amazingly helpful thing that Xi Jinping, I mean, they passed the law to this effect. And then, and part of what then went on was Huawei paid some lawyers to basically give an account that said that they don't have to follow this law, that there are kind of exemptions that they can find to this law. And for some on the European side as well, this was also not very reassuring. I mean, you ultimately had Huawei CEO saying, we will not follow this law even if we are told to. And I think running around saying that you're not going to follow various laws for political reasons, I think was not a vastly reassuring statement for European bureaucrats on these things either. So, I mean, there was, I mean, purely on legal grounds, and this was ultimately when the kind of the toolbox that was put together on the European side, and these kind of technical measures that would mean that one had very justified legal grounds for saying that they should be excluded, or that one had to, companies had to adhere to certain requirements, which would include the idea that there would be appropriate means of legal redress if there was going to be spying conducted, and we've gone through this as well on the US side. And this is still a kind of point of contention when it comes to data flows on the US European side. But the Chinese version of it looks like 100 steps further along. And so, I mean, I think this was then the additional problem that you were, and it's why the internal changes in China had mattered. Once upon a time, you could have made a case that said, it's this thriving private sector company that, yes, it's had a lot of subsidies from the Chinese state, but it is more independent. It was not ZTE. It was a kind of buccaneering firm of its own. But we've gone into a point in the Chinese system where it's become almost impossible to make that argument anymore. When it matters, whatever you think of Huawei, there were certain obligations that they had that would mean that the Chinese government could, in the right circumstances, have them do a whole list of different things if required on national security grounds. And there was no really good way out of that argument. Again, whatever one thought about their intentions on, and what the commercial impact would have been if they'd done this. The point was, at the point in which they would do it, yes, no one would then put Huawei in their networks again, but by then it would be too late. And I think this was
it's a bit like, oh, we'll put the padlock on after all the chickens get out of the coop, yeah. And like what you're saying, do you think it was always, or do you think that Xi Jinping's sort of rule in China has made like a real marked difference, or is it just like that we see it now more openly?
I mean, I think that has been the other big shift, and the way I think the way some of the China analysts describe it, it is this move from soft authoritarianism to totalitarianism. And I mean, the kind of that's been the tangible difference that there's been, and one can debate. And I mean, certainly in the book, and for lots of people, it's not just a Xi Jinping question. That's certainly not the case. And you can make an argument that says that this is as much about China's power position as anything else. He's able to do this because China is now strong enough to do this. And in other circumstances, another leader, even Deng Xiaoping, arguably at an appropriate juncture, would have turned around and said, now is the point in which we can kind of step up and throw our weight around differently. We don't have to be we don't have to placate the Americans. We can advance a very different agenda now. And certainly that was already unfolding. A lot of the developments that we are now complaining about in a very different way, the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy stuff and economic coercion. I mean, lots of this stuff was already in evidence before Xi Jinping took over. So it's not unique to him, but it's certainly the case that there are a series of trends in China that have felt like they're going in reverse. The recent party congress, and I mean, whether that's politically, the level of domestic repression, the reach of the party, but on the economic side too, that always been this kind of dangled hope for a long time of just the economic reform piece on this, that China was still marketizing in a certain way. And that was one of the other reasons that all of this took so long. There were real biting reforms that they had to make to join the WTO. And for a long time afterwards, there was still a process that was underway there. And there were still figures who looked like they were kind of part of that process and did genuinely want to make some of these changes. Under Xi Jinping, it is politics first, security first, fused into this kind of ideological cocktail as well that's increasingly come to the fore. Yeah. And the economy does not matter as much. So it means that China's economic power is also far more instrumentalized to serve certain political and security goals. And so the idea, as with the kind of, it would be commercially problematic if they did X and Y, it's been very economically problematic for China to take a lot of the decisions that they've been taking in the last period of time. And they've decided to do it anyway because the priorities have shifted. And that is something that bears the imprint of Xi Jinping. I think there would have been other leaders who would have balanced this out differently. And I mean, I cite in the book this point after the financial crisis when I went to meet this Chinese academic who kind of, basically said, the cooperation times are done. I am done. The only debate now is, should we be more assertive now or more assertive later? The strategic direction is now clear. And there are some who think Xi Jinping moved too fast. There are a couple of major vulnerabilities that China still has, particularly in the technology sector and in global finance. The dollar system.
I was about to say, do you mean sort of microchips, and then financially? I'm assuming we're just talking strength of the Chinese yen versus the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, you have the two dimensions of vulnerability are essentially that China is still dependent on US intellectual property, and not just US. I mean, kind of to some extent Western across a whole series of different areas. It's still US. I mean, semiconductors has been one focal point, and on advanced semiconductors. But it's software, it's design tools, it's a whole kind of list of things, and it cuts across a range of different areas. And there are still just areas where China, although they've thrown prodigious sums of money into trying to build up the indigenous capabilities in these areas, they still lag behind. And if you look at the way they're enforcing the Russia sanctions, there are still a lot of Chinese companies who are totally paranoid about being cut off from access to the Western technological and the US ecosystem. If they get slapped with the same export control.
Is that a realistic possibility, though? Like, because like, I always have this like hypothetical discussion with people about it. It's like, look, if say we just decided there's numerous reasons you could decide this, like even before the war in Ukraine, you could say, okay, the West, as the West or as the developed world, we are not cool with what seems to be going on in Xinjiang. And we think that's abhorrent and wrong, and therefore we're going to cut ties with you economically. Like, we're just going to stop. Like, we're just going to stop for 6 months. We're not going to buy anything from you. It's like, is that like in any industry like a realistic possibility? Because it seemed like COVID showed us that so many of our supply chains are so intertwined with China that we wouldn't actually physically be capable of making that decision.
Well, I mean, I think that's the big. I mean, there's two sides to this question now. One is the sort of one is the issue of how we identify and quantify and mitigate some of these specific dependencies where we are genuinely reliant on China in certain critical areas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this has obviously been the case with rare earths and a couple of, but I mean, there are some countries that are still reliant on them for pharmaceutical inputs. Or I mean, we have had a version of globalization that's been very Sino-centric. There are lots of things that run through China at the moment, and the pandemic certainly illustrated that. But some of these are contingent. I mean, there are some that has been true, but it is also possible some of these things do not rely on kind of specific resources that China has, or specific things that can't be replicated elsewhere. It would just take time, and it would be costly to be able to kind of rebalance some of these things. And I think there's a big exercise in figuring out what that would amount to, and how to still trade, but be sufficiently resilient if you did have a kind of Russia-style hard cutoff, that you could live with it in a certain sense.
Yeah.
But the other piece of this is
we say hard cutoff. We've shown what a hard cutoff looks like with Russia. It's like, no, we're not going to use their. No, actually, we kind of need it. No, we're not going to take their grid. Oh no, maybe we kind of need some of that. Do you know what I mean? Like even in the face of this, we haven't managed to hold up to our word.
Well, true, and I mean, I think this is the issue in some of these scenarios with China as well. That I mean, China still needs to trade with us in all serious areas. We still need to trade with China, and the question is what's the map of these dependencies actually look like? Where can we really live without China, and where not? Where are these asymmetrical? Where can they be weaponized one way or the other? I think what we've seen on the technology side is there are some real choke points where if the US cuts off certain specific access to specific technologies, then it will have a kind of highly targeted impact on the Chinese side that will have profound effects on that specific sector. But it's not going to derail the whole of the economic relationship, and they can do that in a very targeted way. And it's quite hard for the Chinese side to retaliate effectively. We'll run through a real test of that with semiconductors in the coming months and to some extent years. But you also have this question, which is, if we go into a scenario which is quite plausible in the years ahead with Taiwan, which could conceivably see would ultimately see a war between the United States and China, we're going to deal with a profound economic shock as a result of that. However involved people choose to be in sanctions or otherwise, and so I mean, on the Chinese side, these vulnerabilities when it comes to financial sanctions are still a huge concern in that situation, because if we're in that sort of environment, which would be substantially greater in terms of direct military clashes versus what we're doing at the moment, which is where this kind of proxy conflict in a certain sense. We'd be in a situation in which you would expect that a number of these financial sanctions would be applied to China, and that's the measures that have been applied to Russia. I think very much the intention has been to conceive of these tools and think about them with future application to contingencies that might involve Taiwan as well, and to be able to threaten that in a certain way to China, to be able to say, look, we've gone further up the escalation ladder on the kind of economic warfare side than you had expected, on central bank measures, on SWIFT, on these things that you thought we wouldn't do. We will do these things, and you can't trust that we won't do them to you too. And so this is still this big point of vulnerability, because if it would be extremely costly to us, but so would the war, and it will be a scenario that would see China in some of these scenarios, or critical firms, or whatever, cut out of the international financial architecture and be treated like Iran or Russia or North Korea or something. And the ripple effects for China would be far greater in some respects than for Russia. I mean, it's a far more intertwined economy than Russia's, even though the blowback would be far greater for the United States, for Europe in that situation as well. But that's still the area in which China knows it's vulnerable, and knows that it needs to build up certain forms of resilience that right now it does not have on the financial side.
So would you say then, in a sense, that the sanctions we're imposing on Russia at the moment are sort of a, just watch out, we could do this to you sort of like thing Just like in obviously there's like the main reason for doing it, but like just in the
Yeah,
background, do you think that's what like some of the Western powers are thinking?
especially on the US side, certainly. I think this everyone who is at the top levels crafting policy on this on the US side has China in mind on any of these questions as well. It's kind of this has been a crisis where rather than being purely kind of pulled away from the China thinking as had happened in the past, the China thinking on this has been completely ingrained in some of the tactics and approaches and longer term strategy involved in this. So certainly when it comes to the financial sanctions, the export controls, there's been a kind of mindedness and planning and thinking about what this would mean for China too. And in fact, some of the measures, I mean, some of them were in motion already, but we've seen on the Chinese on the chip sector, some of the measures, they're not some of these are similar tools that have been used on the US side as the tools that have been used against Russia. And those tools were pioneered against Huawei. And so, I mean, when you're going through and kind of looking at the traceability of kind of everything becomes easier when you've done it once in a specific application. We've seen this with sanctions across the board. You'd never have had the Iran sanctions without the North Korea sanctions. You'd never have had the Russia sanctions without the Iran sanctions. And China becomes more imaginable after what we've seen with Russia than it was before. We'd seen what we've seen with Russia, and we've kind of tested out the muscle memory and the kind of how will this work and what will the points of tension be. And again, it would be a radically different and more difficult task and with very different consequences. But China now has to entertain the possibility that we would operate at a higher level than I think they had thought was likely at the beginning of this year.
So do you think that some sort of new Cold War, perhaps with Taiwan at the center, is like a realistic possible? Like, well, it's definitely a realistic possibility. How realistic is that possibility in the future? Like, is that a 95% certainty? Is it like 5%? Like, where would you put? Like, how concerned are you about that possibility?
I think it had been. I mean, I will play the numbers game with this. There are people on the US side at the moment who are towards this being an expectation that this is something that happens in the time frame that is the 2027 timeframe, which is often the kind of date that is used, which was kind of originally framed as essentially when would the PLA be capable of conducting an invasion of Taiwan successfully. I mean, crudely reduced. This has morphed a bit in some of the analysis to if they are capable of doing this, then this is also when they would do this, with the wild card as well of what goes on in the Taiwanese elections in 2024 and how that fits together with the US elections in 2024. And so some of the different dynamics there are then where I think there are concerns that, you know, how some of those scenarios might play out, how China might choose to approach these things. So there is the kind of high level probability that's accorded to some. From my perspective, and some people who've been watching this, I think the risk has gone up considerably. I still have questions about whether it will be considered wise on the Chinese side. And I mean, you can run through and say there are all sorts of unwise things that Xi Jinping has done, but they're a different kind of approach to the approach that Putin has taken. It's not a like for like. And the PLA is still kind of poorly tested out in combat. I think there's still going to be a degree of wariness there. I still think the percentage risks have increased considerably. And if you have a 20% risk of these scenarios, given the scale of what would be involved, that's a very problematically high level of risk, whereas I think you'd have pared it down something below that before. And Xi Jinping clearly has a different outlook on these things. What we've seen from recent Party Congress is very much this kind of preparing the society and the economy for struggle. It's more autarkic. It's getting ready for some of these scenarios. It doesn't have to be that he chooses to go ahead with them, but there will be a level of military capacity and preparedness, and there will be a level of societal capacity and preparedness in the coming years that will look very different from what we've had before. And so you then get into the zone of, are there particular windows, are there particular risk junctures where these calculations kind of shift in a particular direction. So I think that is a real concern in a way that has increased, but I don't think it's still the primary scenario. I think, although we have to kind of prepare for that possibility, and that would, of course, have a dramatic reconditioning effect on everything. I mean, would have a far more dramatic impact than anything else we've seen in decades. I think we're still more likely to be in a kind of a slower paced process on all of this, something that is something much more like a kind of global system struggle that's underway, that on the Chinese side, it's taking on increasingly overt ideological, anti-Western qualities, and what we've seen with China and Russia is something that I would expect both to be kind of deepened, replicated in certain other ways. I think you've got away from this period on the Chinese side where you have something that looks like non-alignment. They want their own coalition. It may not be as capable a coalition as the West and the advanced industrial democracies, but it can certainly complicate and make life considerably more difficult for the US and its allies than China operating alone. And so I think they're thinking very seriously about that. But I think the real game from their perspective as well is the global South, the developing world, where, if you look at the list of countries that were the sanctions coalition for Ukraine, for Russia's invasion, and then you look at everyone else who's not been involved, from China's perspective, that's who you're playing for in different ways. That's vast swathes of the world outside the US alliance network, and a handful of others. And I think the sense is still, for the long-term kind of global balance on this, yes, China might have to write off the liberal democracies, but that looks like a smaller group. And at the moment, it has the preponderance of economic and military power and technological power. But 2030, 2040, 2050, what does this look like if you're able to put yourself in the position to occupy a dominant role in many of the other emerging economies? How far are you able to position yourself to kind of put the pieces together on the global puzzle in a way that means that you're dealing with a kind of shrunken, kind of defensive version of the Western liberal democracies, in a way that you were once the shrunken defensive version of the few remaining communist states or authoritarian states. And I think that's, to me, the longer term, more probable kind of way in which this is likely to play out. And during a period in which China's going to be facing a lot of difficulties. Economic growth has dropped. The ideological and securitized turn, of course, is not fantastic for economic growth rates. A struggle model is not the same as reform and opening. So in some ways, this is going to be a less attractive, less dynamic China that's capabilities advance not as quickly as they were before, but in much more targeted ways, in ways that are still going to be extremely consequential to political security interests of the United States, of Europe, of the other democracies, and with a much more kind of ideological drive to it, a much more kind of overtly confrontational quality than what we've experienced before.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough to know how it's going to play out, but to get a much better understanding of all about how this race for the future is going to play out, definitely people check out The Rupture. Comes highly recommended. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it, actually, man. It was really well written. So thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure chatting and to read your book. Is there anything else apart from the book that you want to point people towards, like your social medias, Twitter, that sort of jazz?
Twitter, AJW Small, and there's more information about the book on the website, andrewsmall.org.
Wonderful. So yeah, man, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time. So whenever I'd be out for a walk, whenever I was going to cook dinner, whenever I was doing cleaning, I always used to spend my time listening to music. And I still really enjoy listening to a lot of music. But what I've discovered is that I can consume so many more books when I'm using something like Open Audible. It's a fantastic, fantastic way for me to make my way through all the things I have to read for this podcast, for things I want to read for fun. That's like fiction and non-fiction. Sometimes I actually prefer fiction when it's being read to me. I like someone doing the voices, like someone, really getting into the characters. In the case of both fiction and non-fiction, it allows me to spend way more time visualizing what I'm reading. So I can think more about the ideas, I can think more about the scenes that people are trying to paint, and ultimately it just gives my brain more space to think because I'm not concentrating on the words in front of me or trying to stay focused on it. Instead, I can just sort of mindlessly get on with whatever task I'm doing and listening via Open Audible. Now, the reason Open Audible is great is because it allows me to do it straight from my desktop. I try to stay away from my phone as much as possible in order to sort of maximize my productivity because it can be a very fast way to waste half an hour. Whereas if I just open my laptop and hit play on Open Audible, I can connect it to my Bluetooth speaker and then I don't even have to go anywhere near my phone. Do you like free stuff? I'm sure you do. Well, I'm going to give away a free copy of Open Audible to one lucky person that signs up for my mailing list in the next month. Now, those of you who are already signed up, don't worry. You can be involved in the draw as well. Just give me a rating or review on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, and post it on Twitter. Send it to me via email. Respond to something I've posted on YouTube. Somewhere you can prove you've got a screenshot and I will enter you in the draw. I have to admit, I used to be a little bit of a book snob. I wouldn't even consider a Kindle, let alone an audiobook. It just felt like cheating. But that is until I tried Audible and Open Audible. Ever wonder where I find the time to read all the books that my guests have written on this show? Well, this is the answer. When I'm behind in my reading, I just jump to audiobook. Open Audible is a cross-platform audiobook manager designed for Audible users that can allow you to download, view, manage, and connect your favorite audiobooks on MP3 so that you can enjoy them across all your devices. Best of all, you can control it all from a desktop application. I'm giving away a copy of Open Audible for the entire month of November. All you have to do is sign up to my mailing list. You'll find the link in the description below, or go to openaudible.org for more information.